I've been a graphic designer for a pretty long time. In fact, I picked it up when I was in early high school, kind of late middle school. My brother, he was really into computers, and so he built me my own computer out of some spare parts, and he put Linux on it, and I found some free graphic editing software, and I just started learning how to do it. I was creative naturally, and so I would start figuring out, like, if I use this effect on this image, what does that do, and what happens if I add this component here, and what happens if I put the layers in this way, and all of those things. And I quickly became pretty adept at using Photoshop and some of the other graphic editing software that's out there. And for me, this was just a huge thing for me, because I've always been creative. I love painting, I love watercolors, I love doing sculptures and modeling clay, and I've even done jewelry. I've done all sorts of different creative things and artworks and different forms of art. And I love graphic design though, because of how I can just quickly move things around and change the way that things are ordered and all that kind of thing. But the point is that I love being creative, and I love having an outlet for my creativity. And you know what? I know that this is because it's just part of how God made me. It's just part of how God made me to be. You see, God is also a creative. In fact, he's the creator of creativity. So he himself is like the source of where that creativity comes from. And we're in this series called In the Beginning, God Loved. And last week, Hannah kind of gave us an overview of where we're going to be going over the next several months as we trek our way through the Old Testament. We're going to break that up for you into some smaller bites so that we can really understand it. But really the idea is, let's understand how the Old Testament all works together. And I have the privilege of starting us off in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. So really starting into the narrative of the Old Testament. And as we begin into the first part of the Bible today, looking at Genesis, this idea of God being a creator is where it all starts. Genesis 1:1, the first verse in the whole Bible, starts this way. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then it begins to talk about all of the different things that God created. You see, right away, the first thing that we learn about God, if you were to pick up the Bible having never heard of God before, the first thing that you would learn is that God is a creator. He loves to create. Are there any other artists out there? If you are an artist of any kind, feel free to let us know in the comments or send us some of your work. We'd love to see it and just celebrate with you that gift of God that he's given you. And so if you're an artist, just let us know. I'd love to find out. But if you're an artist, you'll know what I'm about to say. When you're an artist, you always put some of yourself into whatever you create, right? And that's because art is a process. When you're creating something, you have to search within yourself for this idea or this concept or this image or this picture. And it can be a process of soul searching sometimes to really pull out that idea and put it on paper or on a digital canvas like I tend to do. And so you put some of yourself into those things when you create. And you can see this exact same quality with God. See, if you go read Genesis 1, you'll see that God does the exact same thing. In everything that he's created, you can see some of his own artistry and character. The skies, the ocean, space, the mountains, they all explode with the reality that God is magnificent, the grandeur of who he is, his infinitude, his expanse, his glory. Things like fire, the sun, raging rivers, they all show some part of God's character too. You can see his raw, uncontainable power and intensity. And then there's all the creatures, right? Animals, plants, things like that. Everything that's all over the earth. Some animals like lions and eagles in particular, they carry qualities of God's spirit. Like you see courage and strength, even his kingship. And then there's other animals that they show us that God has a sense of humor. Okay, because, have you ever seen the blobfish? right? Or just the way that like a chicken walks. Like, it's like, what in the world? God, like, that looks so strange. And I think that usually shows us that God is kind of funny and that he has a sense of humor. You can see God's great power and majesty when you look at these things. In fact, the reality is that if you look at the big picture as well as the small picture, you can see some of God's character. I mean, the complexity of a single cell, the entire circulatory system of the human body, magnetic fields, pressure systems, weather, all of these things. It's just God has this ability to create things that are so magnificent and huge, yet so carefully complex, and where he did all of that fine work. The fact that there's over 7,000 varieties just of apples shows that God is incredibly creative. But there was something that God created in the beginning that he put all of himself into. Something that was meant to reflect his character in a way like no other. Do you know what they call it when an artist puts all of themselves into something? That piece that they create that makes like a picture of who they are, that they would say, if you look at this piece of art that I've created, you will know who I really am. Do you know what they call that? Their masterpiece. Their masterpiece. Ephesians 2:10 in the New Testament says it this way: for we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. That's right, people, the human race. We are God's masterpiece. We were then and we still are today God's masterpiece. He put so much of his nature into us that, in fact, if you were to look at everything else, you would see that there's nothing as close as human beings. Everything else in Genesis, it says that God spoke it into existence, but not mankind. No, Genesis 2:7 says that the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground. That's already way different than everything else. And then watch this, because this is hugely different than speaking something into existence. It says he breathed the breath of life into the man, into his nostrils, and the man became a living person, or some translations say a living soul. Do you see the great care and intention by God in the way that he made Adam, the first man? This was already something hugely different, something new, something he cared a great deal about, because he put his whole self into it, enough that he breathed his own breath into our lungs. And woman, in the same way, God took a rib from Adam's side while he was in a deep sleep, and he took that bone and flesh and he carefully and gently formed Eve and made her a living soul. This was different. This was different. God, in forming mankind, was creating someone to directly reflect his nature. And not just to reflect it, but to carry his nature, to be like him. Whereas other aspects of creation only kind of partially retained his character and reflected his nature, mankind was created to be a clear reflection of that nature, like a big mirror. In theology, we call this the image of God. Mankind was meant to bear God's image. And we were created to perfectly carry it. So, what happened? What happened to God's masterpiece? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case today. If we were a reflection of God's character and image, we're like a mirror that's been pretty badly warped or even shattered. I mean, if we are God's masterpiece, what does this say about God? Is he like this? No. It has nothing to do with God's character being corrupt. He's good, and his nature never changes. It has everything to do, though, with us being corrupted. You see, like I mentioned before, I do graphic design, and sometimes what will happen is you can have a file on your computer, and this doesn't just happen with graphic design, but with my art, a file can get corrupted, which is where pieces of it get fragmented or removed, or things happen to where you can't open that file anymore because it's been corrupted. It has nothing to do with me as the creator. It has everything to do with that file having a corruption. And a covenant that God made with us shows where this happened and how this happened. A covenant is a promise made between God and mankind. And there are always blessings if the covenant is kept, and curses if the covenant is broken. Blessings are promises about how God will take care of and lavish upon mankind. Curses outline the natural consequences of what happens if you break that covenant. God's covenant with Adam was pretty simple. Care and protect the Garden of Eden. And don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was in the center of the garden. This was the only tree, you gotta understand this was the only tree in the vast and plentiful expanse of the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve were not allowed to eat from. It's a simple boundary, and really that's not unfair when there's so much that God has provided for them to eat. If Adam and Eve kept this covenant, they continued to enjoy the blessing of Eden and a world made perfect and unstained from sin and death. If they break the covenant, then the curse of sin and death would take root and they would die. And now recognize, this is really important. This curse is nothing but the natural repercussions of introducing sin and disobedience to a world that was created without sin and disobedience. It's what happens when mankind, who was created to bear the image of God, decides to introduce a hammer to this mirror that is their soul and their spirit. And it messes up, it breaks, it shatters that reflection. The image gets distorted and broken. It's the natural consequence. Well, now you see what happened. We broke that covenant. Adam and Eve together were in this sin. But it wasn't them alone, because Satan, God's enemy, was a key player in this sin. Satan hates God. He always has. He was created to worship God as an angel in heaven, and instead wanted to be like God. He chose to rebel against God. He wanted to be worshiped himself. And so he had taken the form of a serpent in the Garden of Eden, determined to destroy anything that looked even remotely like God, everything that God had created, to make sure that anything that even looked like him would not survive. So he lied to and deceived Adam and Eve, who were together in the garden, into believing that God wasn't telling them the whole story. This is what it says in Genesis 3, 2-7. It says, "The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild animals that the Lord had made. One day, he asked the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden?'" And you can see already, he's already twisting and adding doubt into these words because God never said that, right? But Eve still answers well. She says in verse 2, "Of course we may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden." Verse 3, "It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we're not allowed to eat. God said you must not eat or even touch it, or you will die." Right here, the enemy begins to throw things in that are not true. And he says, "You won't die." The serpent replied to the woman, "God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil." But you see, they were already like God. They were already like God. They weren't missing anything. They were exactly how they were meant to be. But those words of doubt and deceit crept into their hearts. And it says in verse 6, the woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. And at that moment, their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. What often happens when there's a chip or a crack in the glass? It spreads. Even just a small crack can quickly spread, and this is what the first sin was like. Although it was much more than a crack, it was a huge, devastating blow. Nonetheless, these cracks began to spread, and the downward spiral of mankind began. The masterpiece of God was quickly being defaced by our own sin. Cain and Abel were the first children born into the world from Adam and Eve. The first children born into sin. And immediately, the sobering reality that sin had been passed on into their hearts became abundantly clear. Cain, in a deep-seated jealousy against his brother Abel, killed him, the first murder, perpetuating the cycle of sin. And the cracks spread. Mankind worsened and worsened and worsened and worsened. If you read this heartbreaking section of scripture for yourself in the book of Genesis, when you read the genealogy of mankind, where it talks about Adam and his descendants all the way through till Noah, it's hard not to notice the stark and bitter reality of mankind's broken covenant, because you see this phrase as it goes from person to person. It says this person lived this many years and he died. And then this person lived this many years and he died. And he died. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. And it keeps going. The natural repercussion of introducing sin and disobedience to a world created without sin and disobedience, to created beings that were meant to live forever. And he died, and he died, and he died. The cracks get wider and wider, until the image of God becomes barely distinguishable, until no one is anything like him anymore. The hearts of mankind became contorted and mutilated until we began to look like someone else. You couldn't even see that image anymore, until we didn't even remember where we came from or who we belonged to. We couldn't remember who our Father was. The masterpiece was completely, utterly compromised and unrecognizable. Genesis 6:5-6 says that the Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, that he saw everything, that everything they thought or even imagined, everything in their minds was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry he had ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. His most treasured of all creation, the one thing that he created, putting his very image into, so extremely wicked that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. The image of God, his masterpiece in us, completely destroyed. Was there any hope of having it restored? You see, deep in the depths of mankind, the same root of sin from Adam and Eve had worked its way into the heart of every single person. Instead of mankind bearing God's nature, they bore the very opposite of God's nature and character. Total evil, complete and utter wickedness, it says. And so verse 7 continues, and the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky. I'm sorry I ever made them. Now it's tempting here, just lift for a minute. It's tempting here to rewrite the narrative. It's really tempting, because you've probably done this before without even meaning to. You might be even doing it right now. But be careful not to unintentionally put words into God's mouth or to misinterpret the why behind this decision. You see, when you read those words, how do you read them? Does God sound like a harsh, judgmental parent who just is fed up with his kids and tired of them? Like, you know what? No, we're done. Like, I'm just gonna get rid of this. Like, does it sound like that? Or does he sound cold and vindictive and detached, like a boss? Does he sound disgusted with people and just too lazy to deal with it? Like, ugh, yeah, get rid of that. No, yeah. How do you read it? God has been accused of all these things before. But don't change the narrative. Because remember, this is why we're doing the series on the Old Testament. Why we're looking at In the Beginning God Loved. Because when you can see the bigger picture and how things work together, you can see the reality. You can see the true narrative. And at Courageous Church, we really believe in bold truth and bold love. And you can see both of them in this section. You see, the truth in this narrative is that God's heart was broken for his creation. It was broken. It broke his heart to see humanity and all of creation, who he had created to be good and to reflect his character, his masterpiece, so totally evil that they, in their very thoughts and imaginations, were flooded entirely and constantly with evil. It broke his heart. It broke it. And so God, deeply grieved by the loss of his most loved and valuable relationships and of his masterpiece, he decided to wipe the human race, all creation itself, torn apart from sin, from the earth. Everyone and everything, except for Noah. Literally the one person in all of creation who still had a living relationship with God. So God, showing mercy, great mercy to Noah and his family, instructed Noah to build a large vessel called an ark, large enough to house himself and his family and two of every animal that walked the earth. This thing was really big. And then it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Scripture says that the springs from the ground also erupted, and so there was thoroughly water filling the entire planet with enough to cover even the tops of the mountains. And eventually, after almost a year on the waters came down. Noah and his family and all the animals exited the ark, and then God used Noah's family as the seed to repopulate the earth. He went through these great lengths, rescuing Noah and his family, sending a flood, using them to be the seed that would repopulate all of mankind. But what happened after all of that? Can you guess? Sin began creeping back in again. Why? Because there's a root of sin in every human heart. Because of the sin of Adam and Eve, because of that broken covenant, because of the curse of sin, that is the natural repercussion of allowing sin and disobedience to come into a world created without sin and disobedience. I had a pretty awful experience a couple weeks ago here, and I'm telling you the story here. So we had a tree root that grew into the wastewater pipe of our house. And that's where everything goes out. All of our water from our showers and our sink and our sewage. And something awful happened. If you can track with me here, the root came in and blocked the pipe. And you can imagine, what does that do? Well, that stops things from going through the pipe, right? And what happened is that it actually all began to back up into our downstairs shower. And so something awful happened. I had to get on my hands and knees. I had to put on protective equipment, and I had to scrub and clean that thing with bleach and all sorts of other chemicals to make it clean and safe and not awful, okay? I had to do this awful, awful work. I had to flush it with bleach. I had to flush it with water. I had to clean it. I had to get all the gross stuff out. I had to make it new again. This is what the flood was. God had to clear away everything evil. Remember God's covenant with Adam? He said that death would come if the covenant was broken, and it did. And even then, God showed his grace and love for mankind by leaving Noah to repopulate the earth. He didn't have to do that. In fact, God knew Noah was still going to have that root of sin in his heart. He knew that it would come back again. But because of his great grace and because Noah had chosen to follow God, God wasn't about to wipe him away too. But just like my plumbing issue, without dealing with the root down the drain, my shower would have simply become contaminated once again. And God knew this too. It's the same with us. Without dealing with the root issue of sin that we all have, that came from Adam and Eve in the garden when they sinned, we will always have that crack in our glass, that root in our hearts, that chip that spreads and shatters us so that that reflection of the image of God is distorted and not as it was created to be. Without dealing with the root of sin, we will never be able to fully bear the image of God like we were designed to. Without dealing with the root of sin, we will never be able to live out who we were really made to be as God's masterpiece. Something needed to be done. So what would be done? We needed restoration. Well, like I said before, God is the author of this story. This is a story that we're telling in the Old Testament. And really, the Old Testament and the New Testament, they work together. One tells the story and one tells the answer and the continuation of that story. He knew what would come. And that's why in Genesis 3, right when this first happened, right when that very first crack happened in the glass, God was talking to Adam and Eve and the serpent, talking about what was going to have to happen now. When he says this, look at this. This is verse 14 of chapter 3 of Genesis. He's talking to the serpent, and he says, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all animals, domestic and wild. You will crawl on your belly, groveling in the dust as long as you live. And I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." And in that moment, that short moment, God made a promise that someone would come. A descendant from Adam and Eve who would crush the head of Satan, being wounded himself, and who would triumph over him. This man, he wouldn't be anything like Adam. He would be a new kind of man, a man without that root of sin in his heart. In fact, he himself would be the one to remove that root of sin from others. And here's like the over the top, just almost too good to be true part of this story, our story. This man would be God himself, Jesus. Listen to this from the book of Romans, which just explains this so well. This is verses 12 and 18 and 19. Listen to this. When Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. Verse 18. Yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for everyone, right? Because we're under that covenant. But Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and new life for everyone. Because one person disobeyed God, many became sinners, but because one other person obeyed God, many will be made righteous. This is so important. In fact, this is so key to the message and every other message that you're going to hear in this series through the Old Testament. Because right after Adam and Eve sinned, when God confronted them and told them what would happen because of their sin, how they had broken their covenant with him, he showed us a glimpse of his character. This facet of his heart and his love for us that absolutely changes everything. And here it is. God makes the way to restore his masterpiece in you. God makes the way to restore his masterpiece in you. He didn't have to do that. It's like if he was painting a painting and something happened that just utterly destroyed that painting, he could say, you know what, I'm just going to throw this out. I'm done with it. I'm heartbroken because it got destroyed, but you know what, I'm done with it. I just can't handle it. But no, he says, I'm coming back for you. I'm coming back for you, and I'm going to make the way for this masterpiece I've created to be restored. When we break our half of the covenant, he comes back for us. When we over and over and over again break our half of the covenant, he always comes back. You'll see this over and over again as we go through the Old Testament. When we fail, he always pursues us. He comes to our rescue. When we deserve nothing, he gives grace and offers restoration. And when we are stuck in our root of sin, deep in our hearts, cracks covering the surface of this mirror of our spirit, Jesus can pull off the roots and restore our broken, cracked reflection, so that once again we can bear God's image and be who he has made us to be. Jesus makes us clean and restores us to new life. It's like the world that went under those flood waters where they rose up above and everything old died. But then when they came back out of those waters, they were redeemed from sin, raised to a new life. And this is also what baptism is all about. In fact, we're doing a baptism here this morning in person for our in-person gathering today at Courageous Church. If you're interested in baptism after I talk about it here, please respond at wearecourageous.church/respond and let us know that you're interested in baptism, because we'd love to have a conversation with you about it. But what baptism is when you come to Jesus and you come as you are, cracked, broken, dirty with sin, buried in shame. But then you choose to give your life to Jesus, to follow him with all that you are, to give all of that stuff to him. And he redeems you. He restores you. He removes the root. He fixes the cracks. You see, there are some things that only God can do. Restoring our broken, defaced, cracked selves is one of those things. And he does it by making us new. Baptism is when you are intentionally turning from your old life, letting God bury it beneath the water, and raising you into a new life with Jesus. Maybe you need to recognize the root of sin in your heart today. As I've talked, these words reflect in your spirit, and you can feel your own brokenness. You can sense, you know, that you are cracked and you have this root that you can't do anything about. If you've never given your life to Jesus, you can make today your day. Do you see the cracks? Let me assure you, you can't do anything about them on your own, but Jesus can. There's some things that only God can do. If that's you, will you pray with me? Jesus, I have a cracked and broken spirit. I'm sorry for my sins. I need your help to be restored back to new life again. I ask you to help me, and I give you my whole life. Help me to follow you, Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen. It's that simple. Now, if you prayed that prayer, I'm really excited for you. And please respond, scan the QR code on the screen, or go to wearecourageous.church/respond to let us know that you've made that decision to follow Jesus. And we can follow up with you, equip you, help you get connected into a discipleship relationship where somebody comes alongside you and teaches you how to walk this new life with Jesus. But church, as we enter in this afternoon after church into this time of baptism, I encourage you, as the church community, we also want to reflect the image of God. And we can do that by being there for each other, coming back for each other, right? Not leaving anyone behind, supporting everyone who is actively learning how to follow God and to be part of this story together. In fact, we are called to extend the same grace that was extended to us. That's part of what it means to have the bold love of Jesus and to live out of the bold truth of Jesus that results in a bold life that we have with our 3 core values here at Courageous Church. So Courageous Church, if you're watching with us online, we're so excited that you get to be part of this with us here. We love you so much. If you, again, need to respond, you can scan the code at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, know that we are praying for you, we love you, and we're looking forward to seeing you again next week.